relevant in this context. So David's lab discovered there's a peptide called tachykinin. It's related to another molecule that's involved in pain relief called substance P that we all make. Tachykinin has a bunch of different forms, but in humans there's tachykinin 1 and tachykinin 2. In mice or humans that are socially isolated for a period of time, tachykinin levels go through the roof. This is very relevant to the recent past around the pandemic, in my opinion. It goes through the roof. And what happens? It creates anxiety, anger, and in particular, aggression. And so there are drugs that are tachykinin inhibitors. And I asked David, I said, well, why aren't we giving tachykinin inhibitors to people that are feeling anxious and aggressive and, kind of tamp that down? And we just had yet another school shooting, and we could talk about what that's about, or not. And he said, this drug is actually approved. It's very safe.
Stop. What are you saying?
There's a drug that can block.
But you're saying what that's about, but we're not.
Oh, sorry. The tachykinin. I mean, was it elevated in, for instance, the kid that went and shot all those kids? How
could they find that out post-mortem?
I think they could do what's called mRNA in situ hybridization. They could see how much of the gene for tachykinin was being made. I think they should do post-mortem. I don't know how he was killed if his brain is still intact. I think, like most people, there's very little concern about him and more concern about the victims, as it should be. But just like with CTE and football players, you want to know where the damage was, and also whether or not there was a brain thing there. And if that brain thing was there, it doesn't mean necessarily that he was born with a bad brain. He might have been born with a dysfunctional brain. But social isolation increases anxiety and aggression. There's no question. And actually, I was in
social isolation increases aggression.
Absolutely.
Really?
Absolutely. Feelings of aggression and kind of friction with the world. Us, them kind of thinking.
Okay.
I was in New York, this is a few months back, and it was the most eerie experience because we were there recording some podcasts, and something came over the news that, there was literally killer loose, and it was that guy in Brooklyn went into a subway, released some smoke bombs, and shot people, right?
Right.
They found him in the Lower East Side walking around. Someone found him. So killer on the loose in New York became a real thing for the time we were there. And it was super weird because we're staying down near the Lower East Side. And they get the guy, and what do they say? They say the same thing they always say about these guys. He was a loner. He was really socially isolated. Then you find the angry posts. You find the things online. But it's never like, you've got crazies like the BTK killer and people who were like in their church and stuff, but were sociopathic killers on the sly. But these kind of what seem like random acts of aggression, almost always these people were highly socially isolated. And I'm not evoking sympathy. I want to be very clear.
I know what you're saying.
Nothing makes me more. I think everyone is furious and frustrated about this situation with the shooting. But I asked David about this. I was like, why aren't these drugs being used or prescribed? And he said, because years ago, there was a trial at a pharmaceutical company exploring the role of this drug in schizophrenia for reasons that aren't clear. And it didn't work. And it cost the company a ton of money. So now no companies want to go near it. There's this kind of, blacklisting of drugs that failed in trials. And as a consequence, there's probably dozens, if not hundreds, of very useful medications out there that are just not being explored.
So when they do studies on people to try to find out what areas of the brain that you can ignite to get people hostile, how would they perform those studies?
So unfortunately, I guess fortunately for guys like Elon, because they have companies based on this, but unfortunately for kind of the exploratory purposes, making this easier, they shave the head in a little spot, they make a tiny little hole in the skull, and they're lowering electrodes down there. And the way these electrodes are built, they're not just a single wire. It's actually pretty cool. It's like a barrel of wires, and they're able to put them to different depths. So, you imagine 100 or 1,000 wires all at different depths and, probing around and stimulating at different levels. So it's all happening very fast. And then they'll hit a spot where the person will say, I feel like I'm about to have a seizure, or sometimes we'll have a full-blown seizure, and they go, okay, that's the spot.
Wow.
And so
we're kind of poking around in the dark?
They are. I mean, the brain, I'd love to tell you that we understand so much about how the brain works. I think we understand a lot, but most of what we know about how human brain structures work are from experiments like the one I just mentioned, which is clinically oriented, but then you're doing some experimentation along the way, or case studies like the famous HM. They always give their initials, not their names, because to maintain anonymity. But we know more about human memory from one guy who had both his hippocampi lesioned because he had epilepsy in his hippocampi. This is a memory encoding area. They kept him in the laboratory for years and studied him. And they learn things like, you might appreciate this. If you went in and you said, hey, I'm Joe, nice to meet you. He'd say, hi, I'm, whoever he was, HM, Henry, whatever. And you'd say, great. And you'd walk out and come back in and say, hi, who are you? And you'd say, I'm Joe. I'm going to tell you a joke. They did this experiment. And you tell him a joke and he'd